drawing you back to the time of A Place in the Sun, and it's just telling a little bit about how it was, what that was like, and you know, I don't want to put the words in. Are you rolling?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But maybe starting by just saying, I guess you were at MGM, and the idea of doing A Place in the Sun, and how old you were, and a little bit about the experience.
Yeah, I was 16, and I was invited to go to Paramount to meet your father and Montgomery Clift, and I was absolutely terrified because Monty, first of all, was, the New York stage actor, and I felt very much the inadequate teenage Hollywood sort of puppet that had just worn pretty clothes and hadn't really acted except with horses and dogs. And your father absolutely intimidated me. He had that wonderful sort of stoic, granite-like face that only occasionally cracked into a smile. And when it did, it was like Mount Rushmore breaking and splitting. It was the most wonderful smile because it hit his eyes and everything sort of sparkled and twinkled. But when he wanted to be mean, those eyes were granite. And it was like... But I was very impressed. I'd never seen anybody, any director, certainly at MGM, work out the plan of, the scenes in drawings, scene by scene, the sets, the costumes with Edith Head, almost frame by frame. He'd worked it out. I'd never, ever seen that. And I was so impressed, scared, but impressed because I realized that this was a man of whom the likes I'd never worked with. And I was very lucky because I was his pet on that film. And as you know, he could have people that were his pets and people that were his peeves. I found that out later, and it was certainly nicer to be one of his pets.
How did he, when you were 16, you portrayed something really beyond your years and experience in that film, didn't you?
Oh, yes. As I said, my leading men were horses and dogs. It was the first time I'd played a so-called adult role. It was the first time I'd really kind of acted, because in National Velvet and all the other films I was playing myself. And it was the first time I'd kissed on screen. And George encouraged me so because he didn't make me feel like a puppet. He was an insinuating director. He gave indications of what he wanted, but didn't tell you specifically what to do or how to move. He would just say, no, stop, that's not quite right. And make you get it from your insides and do it again until it was the way he wanted it.
Do you have any remembrance at all of the shooting of this scene, which is now one of your most famous scenes, and actually one of the moviedom's most famous, the love scene with Monty, the dance scene, and going out on the porch?
Well, I remember when we were doing the dance scene, and Monty says, I love you. And my instinct was to look up into his eyes. And your father said, no, don't. Just slightly widen your eyes and have some expression on your face of whatever it is you're feeling. But don't look up, because that is the conventional thing to do.
Okay, let's just take a little break. That's great at the beginning. Do you remember, I guess it was a couple of years ago when we ran A Place in the Sun at the AFI in Washington? And you came and we saw the film and you talked afterwards. I don't know if you remember what you said.
No, I don't.
You have no, in seeing the film you talked about, you had a wonderful reaction. You said we were all so young then. And you talked about how your children, I was hoping you remembered because.
No, I can't.
Let's talk about, because you knew, and also you might be better to refer to George rather than your father, my father. Call him George.
Okay.
Moving along from A Place in the Sun, the next time you worked together was,
In Giant.
yeah. And had he changed in the intervening 5 years? I mean, you're obviously going to talk about an evolution in his character, his nature as you saw it.
Well, yes, he had. And I was no longer a teenager, and I no longer had anybody on the set to protect me. And that's when I first found out the other side of George, which was the side I didn't want to be on, because he could be really quite cold. And it seemed at times he would deliberately, I've often wondered afterwards whether he didn't do it in a conniving way to make the actor react to a scene, although I don't find that necessary myself. But I remember in one scene, I was supposed to be upset. It was at my sister's wedding, and Rock Hudson and I had been separated, and he walks in, and we look at each other, and it's like tears in the eyes, and then we embrace and go back together. Well, I don't need an artificial stimulant to project that kind of emotion. But something happened that day that was quite extraordinary. We all went out and had lunch at Big Boy's, a hamburger. I came back, and naturally I wasn't wearing my costume. I went into my trailer, and everybody was busy, so I laid down and took a nap. And I woke up, I don't know how much longer, maybe an hour or whatever, and there was not a sound on the sound stage. There was no one around, there was no hairdresser, there was no makeup man, there was no assistant director. And I was in a robe, and I walked out onto the set, and it was all dark. And there were 75 extras in the scene. And there was George sitting in his chair, and the cameraman, and I could see like my makeup man and hairdresser sort of standing in a corner, looking very wary. I said, "What's going on?" And George looked at me and said, "Who the hell do you think you are? You are no better than any of those other people who have been standing up there for an hour and a half waiting for you." And I said, "What?" But nobody called me. I was sound asleep. I didn't know. Nobody had called me, and there were 6 assistant directors. Not one person had knocked on my dressing room door. And I was so upset I started to cry. And then the people that were supposed to get me dressed and ready sort of took me to the trailer and put me together, and I had to redo my makeup, get rid of the tears and all that. And I came back out, and there was dead silence again, and they put the lights on, and these poor people had all been waiting around, totally unbeknownst to me, I promise you. And we did the scene, and I was just a quivering mess of jelly. And when I had to turn around and look at Rock, I mean, the tears just went, because I'd been holding it in. And I often wondered afterwards if he hadn't done that deliberately to make me show a sort of pent-up nervous emotion, and then let it, when I had the chance to release the tears on film, to really let them sort of flow. He was told later on that day that not one of the 6 assistant directors had knocked on my door, and he never apologized. He never said, "I'm sorry," or "I believe you," or anything. And of course I cried all night long. I never could figure that out, whether it was a genuine mistake or whether in his kind of Machiavellian way he was trying to get some deep emotion out of me for the scene.
No, we'll never know.
No.
We ran Giant the other night, and the scene that's really one of the most interesting scenes in the film and holds up so well is the scene with the men downstairs, when they're all sitting around talking politics, and you keep trying to come into the conversation, and would you have any recollection of that scene, or, I mean, that's a scene that really has an attitude about life and women that...
It came very naturally to me.
Really?
I didn't need much direction in that.
But is it a scene that pleases you today when you see it?
Well, yeah, it's more or less me interrupting men, trying to get my word in edgeways, ERA, you know. It came real easy.
Good. Let's just take one little break here.
Oh, okay, that's good now.
I haven't seen the film in so long.
Did he and James Dean, did George and James Dean get along during making Giant?
Well, they did in the very beginning, and I think George respected Jimmy a great deal. But toward the end of the film, it became more and more difficult for George to express his admiration for Jimmy, although I think he still felt it. And the night that Jimmy was killed is a night that I will never forget. We were in the projection room watching the rushes, and George turned the lights off, and I was sitting next to him. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make. Jimmy Dean is dead." It was like everybody went, "No." And, well, I couldn't accept it. And the Texas boy that taught him his dialect, and I went around the studio until 9 o'clock at night, calling the morgue, hospitals, newspapers, trying to find out whether it was true or not, because he was so alive, he was so vital. He was only 24, and it seemed impossible. I'd just been with him that day, driving around the studio in his Porsche. I couldn't believe that he was dead. And around 9 o'clock, I finally was told the news that he was. Had to accept it. Got into my car, or was getting into my car, and I saw this sort of dark, shadowy figure in the night getting into his car, and it was George. And I walked over to George, and I said, "I can't believe that Jimmy is dead." And George said, he had it coming to him. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The way he drove, it was inevitable." And that made my stomach fall several feet. And I drove over the canyon to my home about 100 miles an hour in rage. And I think it was maybe George's way of expressing his own particular kind of grief, that it was inevitable.
What was it like on location at Giant? Was it difficult? I mean, was it hot, or was it?
Hot. It was 120 in the shade, and it was in the summer, August, I think, in September. It was boiling, but we were like a very tightly knit family, because Marfa, Texas had a population of 2,000, I think. So we were like the real Martians. And we really kind of had to stick together. And we'd go to the movies at nighttime and go to the diner and have dinner together. And we all had little tiny houses that were sort of across the road from each other. And sometimes Jimmy and I would sit up until like 3 o'clock in the morning talking. And he would tell me about his past life, some of the grief and unhappiness in his life, and some of his loves and tragedies. And the next day on the set, I'd say, "Hi, Jimmy." And it was almost as if he didn't want to sort of recognize that he had revealed so much of himself the night before. And it would just be a cursory nod of the head. And it would take maybe a day or two for him to become my friend again.
Can you describe George's personality? I mean, what words come to mind to describe George Stevens?
Well, the great white father, he had this stoic, almost Indian-like maintenance of his demeanor, not always temper. And when he released his affection and his sense of fun, it was like on the warpath kind of fun. I mean, we stopped on the train going to Texas, and the two of us went running out over the desert and started picking yuccas and put them in the back of the, what do you call it, observation part of the train. And of course, when we went through another state, they were all removed because it was against the law. And, you know, everybody was playing guitars and drinking tequila, and he was totally different. He was just a different man than the stern supervisor of the set.
Could he switch from one to the other quickly?
Yes. I think at times to put you off guard. I think at times it was quite natural.
That he would?
Just go through a change of mood.
What about his humor? Can you talk about his sense of humor?
It was very droll, very dry. And a lot of times you could not discern that he was being humorous except through the twinkle in his eye. And then when his face would crack into a grin. It was a very droll sense of humor. Very good.
Did he talk about his childhood at all? Or when?
No, not much to me.
No. Did he talk about his feelings about the characters in A Place in the Sun much?
He more or less left me alone on that. It was amazing. He trusted my instincts, and he sort of brought them out and let me sort of do my own thing with his guidance. And I trusted him absolutely and totally, which gave me a freedom to experiment that I'd never felt before.
Did he work that way with most actors, to leave them alone, or did he work differently with different people? Or?
Well, no, he didn't. He worked differently with every actor, and mostly at different periods on each film. I mean, there were some scenes with Shelley and Monty where I couldn't believe why he was so cross with them. There seemed to be no apparent reason. And you know, when he sort of spoiled me, there seemed to be no apparent reason for that either. I adored it, mind you. I really had a case of hero worship for George.
Can we cut from it?
So they did.
Oh, there's
That's okay,
something
we're
else.
Okay.
Okay. Would you describe him as a happy man?
I would describe him as a very complex man that had moments of deep grays, blacks, and great heights, and moments of great joy and exuberance, especially through his work and his family.
Those were the most important things to him, his work and his family?
I believe so, yeah.
I just thought of one more thing. You were talking about shooting up at the lake on A Place in the Sun.
Oh, Lake Tahoe in November, when it's already started to snow, and they had to wash down the snow on the sandy parts and off the tops of some of the trees that were in the obvious close-ups. And Monty and I had to go swimming. And Lake Tahoe is a glacial lake, and it was just miserable. Now, George was out there with his big boots on and ear mufflers and gloves and made us do take after take after take. I think I wanted to kill him. And everybody else got to have a brandy, but I was 16, so I got a cup of hot tea, and I didn't think that was fair.
Okay, great.
Don't stand up into this thing, because then you have to go.